So, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us in this first series spotlight on rehabilitation. It's the first one this fall, and I realize many of you are joining as we speak, but we have a full program today. So we're going right ahead and starting today's session, which is one of three. The next one to follow on November 6th and the following one on November 13th. We're shedding the spotlight on the Brain Lab, and the general general theme of these presentations are past, present, and future of COVID-related initiatives and research. And I will, in a moment, hand over the whole presentation to Marie-Hélène Boudrias, professor at the School of Physical and Occupational Therapy. But before I do that, I would like to read the land acknowledgement. McGill University is situated on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst nations. We recognize and respect the Kanien'kehá:ka as the traditional custodians of the lands and waters on which we meet today. Marie-Hélène, over to you.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Merci de vous être joints à nous en si grand nombre aujourd'hui. Je suis ravie de vous présenter un aperçu des recherches menées dans mon laboratoire et d'accueillir des chercheurs invités avec qui nous collaborons dans le cadre de cette série de webinaires sur le thème de la COVID. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us in such large numbers today. I'm delighted to give you an overview of the research in my lab and welcome guest researchers that we collaborate with on different projects to this series of webinars about COVID. In my lab, our research interests can be characterized into three areas, as you can see here: neuroimaging, where we try to quantify brain networks and identify biomarkers of motor and cognitive function using the newest advance in neuroimaging, neurophysiological techniques, and signal processing. Second, neurorehabilitation, where we are doing so in the context of aging, stroke, and long COVID. Our ultimate goal is to design therapeutic interventions specific to each individual based on brain biomarkers. We specifically focus on using brain stimulation, strength training, music, and art therapy. And third, most recently, our team has been interested in the impact of COVID on the brain, the delivery of rehabilitation services, and the well-being of individuals impacted by long COVID. Il nous fait plaisir d'accueillir un chercheur invité, professeur Simon Décary, avec qui nous nous entretiendrons sur des sujets chauds de l'heure en ce qui a trait au progrès en matière de soins, de recherche et de la politique de la COVID longue. Nous avons aussi le plaisir d'accueillir Mme Perrine Ferré, postdoctorante subventionnée par le Fonds de recherche du Québec Santé et qui a joint le Brain Lab en juin 2022. Elle nous présentera les nombreuses transformations des soins et des services dans les centres de réadaptation pour patients hospitalisés, dont elle a été témoin au début de la pandémie de COVID-19, ainsi que des leçons tirées de cette expérience. We are thrilled to welcome guest researcher Professor Simon Décary. Together, we'll dive into the latest developments in care, research, and policies surrounding long COVID. Simon Décary is Assistant Professor of Health Services at the University of Sherbrooke. He is the Co-Scientific Director of Long COVID Web, the CHR Canadian Network for Long COVID Research. He is the President of the Quebec Learning Health System for Long COVID Executive Committee, and is also extensively involved in the integrated care model of 15 sites delivering care to 5,000 patients in the province of Quebec. His funded research projects also include video ethnographic analysis of current long COVID practices and the impact of an online continued professional development course on long COVID. We are also delighted to welcome Madame Perrine Ferré, a postdoctoral fellow in the Brain Lab since 2022. Her research activities focus on the dialogue between researchers and knowledge users in neurological rehabilitation. She's also a research and teaching coordinator at Villa Medica Rehabilitation Hospital in Montreal. At the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, she witnessed the numerous transformation of care and services in inpatient rehab facilities. With the support of a large team of managers and clinicians at CHUS and CHUS around the province, as well as with family and users, she's presenting today about the lesson learned from this experience, this to better be prepared for future crises. Nous répondrons à vos questions en français et en anglais à la fin des présentations. Nous serions ravis de vous entendre sur le contenu présenté dans le cadre de ce webinaire. Nous sommes aussi toujours à la recherche de collaboration, alors n'hésitez pas à nous contacter en utilisant le lien BrainLab ici-bas. We are always open to collaboration and welcome feedback, so feel free to contact us through the BrainLab link. We would love to hear from you. We will answer questions in French and English at the end of the presentations. Sans plus attendre, je laisse la parole au professeur Simon Décary.
Do you hear me right? Do you see the presentation?
Yes.
Which give me a beautiful green color of my skin. This is awesome because I have an infection right now, so it's very bizarre. So thank you very much for the warm welcome. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. So I'm going to talk about long COVID 2024 and 2025. So we're going to take a look in the future of what's coming. So this presentation is really like a year in review. For you, I'm gonna show you some stuff that we're doing internationally and nationally for your interest. So let's begin. So first thing first, long COVID, well, it's still a thing. It hasn't got away. And so our colleagues in the US are still publishing extensively on this topic with us. And this paper was published not so long ago, a few weeks ago, and really inspired this talk. It's published by Dr. Halhali, Dr. Topol, Anna Davis, Lisa McConnell, Akiko Iwasaki. I'm naming these people because they are really international leader right now. So if you want to follow international level researcher, these are the people who are getting updated as much as possible. So in this paper, they assess that right now we most likely have somewhere like 40 million individuals that had long COVID or are currently having a situation of long COVID. So that's many, many people. And we had the report in the last year about the economic impact of long COVID, and always it's in the billion of dollars per year per country that have been done these assessments. And I'm going to show you the assessment for Canada very shortly. So it's a significant impact. And what's interesting is that most of this economic impact is actually not from direct healthcare costs, but from disability-related costs like absenteeism from work and reduce quality of life. So that's very important for us to understand. There was international investment in research throughout the world, but quite honestly, right now, the United States are leading through their recovery initiative. So most of the funding, the significant funding, comes from that directly. So they had an initial investment of $1.15 billion. Recently, they announced another $500 million specifically for clinical trial. And Senator Bernie Sanders proposed a $10 billion bill, so $1 billion per year for the next 10 years. So that's what's happening in the policy front for long COVID. They're looking into funding a lot of research over the next 10 years. So that's very important for us as Canadians to understand. With that, one of the interesting things from the US is that we now have a new definition of long COVID, so from the National Academy of Science. I don't have time. 20 minutes is very short, so I don't have time to go into detail of the definition. I put it there for you. You can have the slides after to take the time to unpack everything here about the new definition. But just to show you some key points. So now in this definition, it's much broader. It's much more specific. You have much more detail than the definition that we used to have with WHO. So there are like three main pillars of the definition. So first you have the common symptoms. So they really pinpoint the different symptoms that are more prevalent. And interestingly, post-exertional malaise that was assessed not in the optimal format, but that was assessed in Recover, is now really at the forefront of this definition. Of course, we can have some people without post-exertional malaise, but now it's recognized as one of the key symptom and driver of disability. The second pillar in the center is really diagnosable conditions or comorbidities that we know are associated with the long COVID diagnosis. So recognizing that some people are going to have myalgic encephalomyelitis or PUTS or MCAS or any other organ impairment that are known to be associated with as a sequelae of COVID-19. So you have the symptoms, now you have the diagnosable condition, and lastly, the third pillar are important feature. Important feature are anything related to the disability and the impact on quality of life. And that's very interesting that they went into that challenges, because it drives a lot of care and social care for these people. And I'm going to talk about this in a few seconds. So new definition from the US, very interesting. Another thing that they did great is to try to pinpoint the physiopathology. So right now, when I'm hearing some people saying like, oh, we don't know a lot about, that's not true. Like we're talking about thousands of biomedical scientific papers describing the physiopathology, and they pinpoint 6 possible physiological pathways. Which are viral persistence, immune dysregulation, microbiome dysbiosis, endothelial inflammation, so that's the microclotting, neuronal inflammation, and mitochondrial dysfunction. And so my current understanding of having meet with these people is that it's unlikely at this time that we're looking at like one unifying pathway that rule over all the pathway. I think we're looking into a pathology with multiple physiological pathway. And I think that this restriction that we impose on ourselves of trying to find one holy grail treatment, it prevented us to using repurposed drug and looking into rehabilitation options outside exercise. Like we're talking a lot about exercise, but rehabilitation is way many more options than only rehabilitation. And that's, I think, now that we have a better understanding of the physiopathology, experts right now advise to research all possible options that could move the needle and reduce disability. So if I'm able to identify patients who have more neuronal inflammation, and I use one of the techniques in Marie-Hélène's lab, and that improve quality of life by 5% or by 10%, and that you can combine this with another option and you get 15, 20%, any options, any repurposed drug are valuable right now to help these patients. And this is going to lead to the launch of hundreds of clinical trials in 2025. So we're really looking into the future. And just to support the point where my opinion is going right now. So this review so we're talking a lot about biomarkers, because biomarkers would be like the holy grail of having a diagnosis. You would take a blood test and you would have one biomarker, you have long COVID or you don't, which is very important right now because we don't have access to rapid tests. So we don't know, in most cases, we don't have the infection. And even the Depistage Center, the screening center, now they don't have any more free bucks of rapid tests, which is crazy in terms of public health, but that's another topic. And so in this review, they identify more than 500 possible blood biomarkers for this disease. So this is great. This is possible target, but like having one biomarker that rule everything else, I'm not so sure of it. And when we look at other disease like HIV and complex disease, well, they move rapidly into having multiple drugs, multiple pathway, multiple option, and that I think is what the United States is teaching us a lot right now. So meanwhile in Canada, what are we doing? So I need to update you on Long COVID Web. So as Marie-Hélène said, Long COVID Web is a $20 million CIHR network that was funded not so long ago to really coordinate all research across Canada. And so I have the honor to be the co-scientific director of this network, and we are closing our second year out of 5. So work is ongoing. And so our vision is really a Canada without long COVID. We aim to accelerate the discovery and validation of Canadian-led science, activate a learning health system that prioritizes the need of individual, identify the best therapeutic and practices, and maintain the surveillance of the impact of long COVID. And we're growing strong. So last month we achieved the 1,000 member mark. So now we have approximately 50% of our membership who are patient with lived experience. We have researcher, clinician, and policymakers. We have a representation in the 4 most populous province of Quebec, Ontario, BC, and Alberta. So, but we're aiming really to expand our reach to other provinces because we know all provinces are dealing with this issue. So when you join Long COVID Web, most people are associated with one main pillar, but we have all pillars of science, so biomedical, clinical, health services, and population health. So we recognize and stimulate all fields of science. I put the QR code here, so if you want to register, it's free, and it gives you 2 main advantages that I'm going to tell you right now. First advantage is that for researcher, we are getting up as a very strong leverage to get funding for your research. So that's only the first 6 months. You see the group had already close to 100 peer review publication and grants. And here, that's a table. So in the first year, we were able to support for more than $13 million of high-level grants and research. So we've been supporting team across all fields of science, either biomedical, clinical trials, but we have health services and population health also in that. So we've been very successful at being a leverage for researcher, but we also give direct funding. So the first year we invested $2 million in different funding projects. So we had foundational project, but the most important for student here are the seed funding projects. So we have a competition where we have 100K project, 50K project, and 25K project, and we basically fund approximately 25 projects, which is great because we have a success rate for approximately 50 to 60% in the 100K, above 75% in the 50K. And we found that these projects were able to attract match funding and in-kind contribution. And just to tell you that this competition was again done this year, and so we're going to announce the result very soon. And it's going to be done next year and the year after and the year after. So you have a pot of $2 million for project every year. And we open the competition every summer. So just so you prepare your project. So direct investment for your research. The second thing that we do at Long COVID Web is to provide a national symposium every year. First year was in Quebec. This year it was done beginning of October in Alberta. And there's going to be a third one in Newfoundland next year. So that's great for students because it assures you that you have a place of national level that you can send your abstract and publish your research. And so next year, we're also launching a national eco platform for training healthcare professional. I'm going to talk about that a little bit in an instance. So that's it for Long COVID Web, a place where student and researcher really can advance their research. I'm going to give you some news from our other partners that are doing national level research. So let's begin by the Public Health Agency of Canada and Statistics Canada. So they have been running for many years a survey of Canadians with long COVID. I'm going to not go in the details of the statistic, but just to tell you that they are continuing to update their survey. And now one of the interesting result that they just published very recently was the spectrum of disability. And now they identified that 20% of all long COVID patients actually have very important disability and limitation in their daily life. And that explains the approximately 100K person with long COVID that are out of work right now because of this disease, and that we need to find solution within our health system for that. So very insightful from Public Health Agency of Canada. And with this data, we now also have a projection of costs. So right now we're estimating between $8 and $50 billion per year of cost for Canada for long COVID. As I said, mainly driven by disability-related expenses such as absenteeism from work and needing social care. News from the Chief Science Officer in Canada. So the Chief Science Officer continues their reporting and follow-up of everything related to policy. They have now confirmed that at the Canadian population level, we're looking at approximately the same prevalence as the United States, so 6 to 7% of the population affected by long COVID. And given the spectrum of disability, we're talking about a 1 to 3% of the population that have more impactful limitation. There are, of course, a lot of details under these numbers, but that's the overall view that we're looking into. And they have published many new recommendations. So there was 18 recommendations in the first year, and now they're adding more. As a summary, they recommend that we improve all area of science to move the needle in the right direction for long COVID. Let's talk about the Public Health Agency in Quebec. So you may have known that the Public Health Agency in Quebec is maintaining the epidemiological surveillance of healthcare professionals. So basically they're following healthcare professionals in our health system and looking at these people because they have a strong control group within these people. They're tracking long COVID in healthcare professional. And they found similar population estimate of approximately 6%, but they have found very important insight for public health. So they have found that there is an increasing cumulative risk of long COVID with reinfection. There is limited protection of vaccination, and there is limited access to rehabilitation care right now. So very insightful data from Public Health Agency in Quebec. Let's talk about CAN-PCC. So CAN-PCC is a Public Health Agency Cochrane Canada initiative. They are currently doing 6 evidence-based guidelines on prevention, testing, clinical intervention, neurological topic, pediatric, and health services. They are conducting multiple systematic review, and they're going to issue more than 20 good practice statements and 100 evidence-based recommendations. So you have their website here. The work is ongoing and it's going to be completed by March 2025, after which we're going to have many years to unpack everything that was done by this group, and it's going to drive us and help us to design better educational strategy. Which leads me 3 minutes before I end my talk about what are we doing in Quebec. I keep a track because I often talk too much. People on this call that know me know. So I'm going to talk about the Quebec Learning Health System for long COVID and Lyme disease. As you may have seen from other talks I did back in 2021, we had envisioned a care trajectory for patients with long COVID in Canada. And so in 2021, the Quebec Ministry of Health invested $20 million to develop in clinical care, to develop a learning health system for long COVID. So what emerged from that was 15 university-based and community-based multidisciplinary teams that were organized as a hub and spoke model over 15 administrative regions. It took years to build a model and train the teams, but today we're proud, we're strong. We have 50 full-time equivalent across medical and rehabilitation discipline that are directly working with these patients. And the model is ongoing. It's super hard to build these kind of model. We have many integration issue. We have many issue with coverage of by physician, by specialist physician. Also, we have a few specialist physician, but access is very complicated. And so we're continuing our work on that. This is a very large project, but it's going well on that front. And for the first time in public, I'm going to show you our tracking system. So this is the current state of the model. So we have close to 4,000 patients within the model. Half of these are currently being followed up by one of the 50 clinicians. So they're receiving support and care. And we have approximately 2,000 that are currently on the waiting list. And it depends a lot on the administrative region. The current delay from being put on the waiting list to the first intervention is at approximately 6 months overall in the model right now. So that's the current state of affairs. And this year we're adding Lyme disease to the model. So we already have close to 700 people in the model. 250 are receiving care, and we have more than 400 on the different waiting lists. And the delay is approximately 1 year for the first contact. So you can see like there are a lot of people, it's imperfect. The access mechanism needs to be refined, but we're working on that. And some people say like, oh, long COVID, it's over. No, not really. So here you can see the trajectory of the total number of users. And while we appear in the last year to have reached like a plateau, the reality is that we still have more patients coming in. And I just looked at the data not so long ago, and we had over 500 new referrals since May 1st of this year. So we're approximately having 100 new referrals from family physician into the model per month, which basically is approximately 1,000, more than 1,000 per year. So people are still getting long COVID. People still need care, and it can be viewed as a plateau, but the reality is that the model needs to be refined to improve access. And so to finish, we're continuing our work. And so we're launching this year a new provincial quality improvement initiative. And so we begin that in September 2024 with conference from the Bateman Horn Center. This month, we launched the communities of practice. Next month, we're going to have the data from the Parcours d'apprentissage patient, which is going to tell us a lot about barriers and facilitator of the territories. In January 2025, we're going to have the educational video for patient put online, so the clinical team can actually do only one-on-one clinical care, not having to redo the educational components. And the one I'm most proud of is this team working with the Fédération des médecins omnipraticiens du Québec. So representing 10,000 family physicians, they're going to have a provincial freely accessible online 2 hours training program for family physician, nurse practitioner, and any healthcare professional who are working in primary care. So they're going to have a 2 hours training program on long COVID. It's going to be launched. The team is working hard, and it's going to be launched beginning of 2025. So as a conclusion, well, long COVID is not quite finished yet. And I want to congratulate our awesome clinical research and policy team. This year, we're expanding services to Lyme disease, and really, we aim to become an international leader in infection-associated chronic conditions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Simon. We already have questions on the chat, but before we take questions, we're going to wait until the end, and we're going to jump into Perrine's talk.
So hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here today to present to you the lessons that we learned from the COVID-19 pandemic. Our aim was to improve crisis preparedness in inpatient rehab facilities. As you can see on these slides, on this slide, we were and we are still today a large group of researchers who gathered at the beginning of the pandemic to study retrospectively what was the impact of the pandemic on rehabilitation care, the quality as well as the quantity we provided in our rehabilitation facility. The group was led by Dr. Boudrias, and our motivation was really to not let a serious crisis such as this one go to waste, and to be able to be better prepared for the next time, because unfortunately we might have to face other crises in the future. So our rationale was that usually rehabilitation care and services are guided by high quality standards based on best practices, which are aimed to optimize recovery for our patients. But at the beginning of the pandemic, so the state of emergency in Quebec was declared on March 13th of 2020. And at the beginning of the pandemic, we have seen many transformations in our rehabilitation facilities. Especially, that was especially true for those facilities who were, so we call them designated by the Ministry of Health to host persons who had contracted the COVID disease. In those institutions, we had to create COVID units, which were isolated from the rest of the facility, so-called hot zones, to host people who were suspected or confirmed cases of COVID-19. Of course, COVID-19 is a multisystemic disease, as Simon was reminding us before, and such disease really can exacerbate the other diagnoses and the other conditions that our patients have to face when they are in rehabilitation. In those units, the COVID units, treatments were provided at bedside, usually by a dedicated team, who were following strict infection prevention measures, including full protective equipment from the head to the toe. Meanwhile, the care was to be continued as usual, or as much as possible, in the so-called cold zones, or those zones with patients who did not contract the disease. So our objective was to compare the quality of rehabilitation in those facilities, those that were designated. And we were interested mostly in the 3 first waves of the pandemic, which are the waves during which we didn't have full access to the vaccines. Our first hypothesis was that all patients who contracted COVID probably showed less recovery because of the infection, because of the disease. The second hypothesis was that those institutions probably had a lower organizational performance. They were maybe less efficient during the pandemic. So that was the case probably for both COVID negative and COVID positive individuals, because there were so many prevention measures and so many changes in the guidelines and the best practices that are usually followed. But we also wanted to provide experience-based insights for future crisis preparedness. And for that reason, we used a mixed method. So first, we went into those designated facilities throughout the province. There were 7 of them, and we did an audit on the medical charts. We did that both for people who contracted the disease, either those who were admitted with the COVID in rehabilitation, so they contracted COVID before their admission in rehab, but were referred to the designated hospital because of the COVID-19, or those, and there were many of them, who contracted the disease during their stay in rehabilitation, so those nosocomial disease. And we also checked at the charts of non-COVID and pre-COVID individuals, so those who were admitted in the year before the pandemic. And we did group comparisons for many different indicators for quality of service of the services. Then we also went and consulted with the stakeholders. So stakeholders who worked or were cared for in both hot zones and cold zones. So we had patients, healthcare professionals, as well as managers from those designated facilities. And we used interviews, questionnaires to do a qualitative analysis. These information were then merged and integrated by way of a deliberative workshop. So we met with the stakeholders along with the researchers and patients and their families to be able to find a consensus on what could be the recommendations. So here is what we found. Well, first, note that we had in total throughout our 7 different sites, we had about 299 cases of COVID who went through those institutions, those designated hospitals. Among the 299, we had 2 categories, those who were admitted with the COVID and those who contracted COVID nosocomially during rehabilitation. And you can see that we have about half and half of each. We had about a similar number of non-COVID individuals who were admitted during the pandemic, so at the same time, but in the cold zones, as well as a similar number of charts of people pre-pandemic. So in charts, which was exhausting, but super interesting, as you can see. So the repartition in terms of program, because in Quebec we work under the assignment of programme clientèle. So you can see that those who were admitted with COVID mostly came from the physical health program. So they were admitted for mostly respiratory issues, sometimes for deconditioning. So mostly in relation with the COVID-19 disease itself. So they contracted COVID and they were sent to rehabilitation hospitals that were designated for that. But we also have a large number of nosocomial infections, and most of them were from the neurology program. So people who suffered from a stroke, for most of them, and who then, during their stay in rehab, contracted the COVID and were sent to the hot zone, the COVID unit. Then we did multiple comparisons. So the p-values here were corrected for the number of comparison. And what you can see, I'm not gonna go through each value, but what you can see here is that there are differences between groups for all our indicators, except for the sex, which was balanced between our individuals, but this was voluntarily. The post-hoc analysis showed that well, first you have to note that regarding COVID-19, the disease, the functional status at admission for all patients who were admitted during the first 3 waves, so COVID positive or COVID negative, were all lower during the pandemic compared with before the pandemic. So lower functional status at admission for everyone during the pandemic. That could be discussed later. Maybe you would have ideas as of why. But it remained, the function remained lower at discharge only for those who contracted COVID, whether before or during their stay. As expected, you can see that those admitted with COVID had a lower functional recovery at discharge. They also stayed usually a very short length of time, about 10 days, which was the time recommended for according to the policies. They also received in the hot zone lower therapeutic dose, so less OTs, PTs, SLPs coming to their bed or bedside. They also had a smaller rehab team, and usually they were older. Those who contracted COVID nosocomially stayed a long time in rehabilitation, and for that reason, they were marked by a lower efficiency in the organization. They stayed longer, but showed less functional improvement compared to all other groups. And probably that this is because their medical status was unstable. About 40% of them, the nosocomial infection, had to be sent back to the hospital to receive acute care. They were also characterized by more delirium, more oxygen intake, so they had to receive more medical care than usual. And they were seen by a larger rehabilitation team. So not always more dose of intervention, but more different professionals, psychologists, travailleurs sociaux, social worker, as well as OT, PT, SLP, etc. So more professional to take care of them. And it's interesting to see that those who did not contract COVID but were admitted during the pandemic, for those, for some reason, the organization had a higher efficiency. Those patients received a higher dose and stayed a shorter time compared to pre-pandemic era, which is interesting. For some reason, we were more efficient in our institutions during the pandemic. For the rest, they were mostly similar to the pre-pandemic period. For our second phase, the qualitative phase, we went and consulted with stakeholders. We met with 88 different persons. We had patients, professionals, and managers. And they were both from the COVID unit as well as the non-COVID unit, because we really wanted to have a better understanding of the how it worked in the designated hospitals and what were the reasons why quality was transformed. So what came out of those interviews and consultation are 12 key recommendations. Those were derived from the consultations, and interestingly, the themes were shared by both hot and cold zones, professionals, patients, etc. Nothing specific to the group was found. The reason is probably because in the cold zone, they were also subjected to many periods of isolation because of preventive measures, but also because of outbreaks, during which the cold zone also had to keep the therapies at bedside, cancel visitation, and as well as going out home to practice functional activities. So the situation was, generally speaking, similar between the two groups. And on the right here, what you see is the frequency at which it was expressed by the participants. So this is the total. So for example, here, many people, about 48% of them, manifested interest to purchase therapeutic equipment, especially for the zones that were in isolation. But what is interesting is that most of those individuals were actually healthcare professionals, because it was important to them to have the right equipment to treat their patient. Another example would be ensure the continuity of care. Quite a good number of participants expressed interest into this recommendation, but most of them were healthcare professionals who were interested to make sure that their patient had care at the end of the rehab. Here I also show some of the citations, both from the hot zones and the cold zones. So what you can see is that the policies that were in place during that time were not always clear. Managers wondered what rules to follow, maybe those of the long-term care facilities or those of the acute care facilities. There were no specific rules for rehabilitation hospitals, in fact. The healthcare professionals regretted that their expertise in terms of clientele, so for example, some were more specialized with strokes, some were more specialized with respiratory treatments, but those who worked in the hot zone were sent there without regards to their expertise, and they had to treat people from many different programs. They found that difficult. The managers also found difficult to have patients who could not go out during their stay in rehabilitation, because usually patients go and they experience when they go home, they meet with their family, and they realize what is important to them in terms of objective and functional recovery. And that did not happen during the pandemic. And that really hindered the discharge. As for the patient, the one theme that came up more frequently and very frequently was the isolation and the boredom. People used words such as wartime, prison. I kept looking at the walls when I was in my room. Some of them stayed, you have to remember, about 2 or 3 months isolated in a room without groups, without visits, without care at every moment of the day. So many of them were bored, and that probably had an impact on their recovery. So as you can see, there were many transformations during that time, but many of the themes were specific to the groups, healthcare professionals, patients, etc., which is why at the final integration step, we wanted to merge both quantitative and qualitative information to derive statements that were consensual between groups. What would be the most important to you all, if we were to face another crisis? And we wanted to make sure that those statements were phrased in the form of policy recommendations. So we organized this workshop. We had 10 participants, and we came up with the 12 different statements. From the 12 different statements, none of them were discarded. So everyone agreed that everything was actually true and important. But those that were the most priority were rephrased. And this is what I present here. We actually did, from those recommendations, we actually did a policy brief in the form of an illustration. And this will be available soon on the website of Unité de Soutien SSA Québec. So I encourage you, especially if you work in a rehab hospital, or if you are interested into this topic, to in the next weeks to go and check on their website, because you can download the infographic both in French and English. So what was important for everyone was really to create an environment that was favorable to therapeutic activities. People need to exercise, they need to be active, but they also need to be active socially speaking. So promote socialization is another recommendation that was consensually found important by everyone. Another recommendation is to ensure safe trajectory, especially so for those programs that are super specific, that require a high expertise, such as stroke, for example. Stroke need to receive care that is specialized from the acute phase up until the chronic phase, and that was not the case during the pandemic. Managers need to have some liberty, some autonomy when it comes to making decisions, because they think a good idea of what could be beneficial to their clients and to their professionals. And finally, value the family, value their implication, because they are here to reinforce the participation of the patients, especially during such difficult moments as those that we went through during the pandemic. So I really want to thank everyone who participated in the study. We had many participants who shared their experiences, and that was of great value. We also had many partners in the rehabilitation facilities who supported us when we went through the data collection. And of course, all the funding partners, without which it would not be possible. So I remain available if you want to ask questions.
Thank you so much, Perrine. Thank you so much, Simon. This is really setting a great ground for, what has happened and where we're going in a way. So thank you very much.